How do we love inclusively? How do we love inclusively in what seems like an isolated and exclusive world? During a time when division seems to turn into hot arguments rather than polite disagreements, let alone thoughtful debate, when communities fueled by the internet seem to gather together about what they're against and not what they're for, and when, despite our advancements in connectivity, we are experiencing loneliness in epidemic proportions. Is it even possible to love inclusively in what seems like a broken, fractured, isolated world? This is the question that we've been asking these past few weeks, and I would like to say this morning, yes. Yes, it is possible, but it takes practice. 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 Daily, hourly, sometimes moment to moment practice. Love is a practice which is exercised and deepened within community. Now, of course, we all know that passage that Mark read, those short words that Christ calls us to love one another the way that he loves. And we know that our identity as disciples is forged when we demonstrate love to each other. But I think that what makes inclusive love difficult is when it reduces love to just a lovely feeling. Because then when we don't feel it, and we often don't, well then how is that going to be a meaningful Christ-like response in this lonely, fractured world? Well, Paul asked similar questions in his day, and he addressed them to the new and developing Jesus communities in the letters that he wrote, like Romans, which we heard from this morning. These were groups of people who were trying to live the way of Christ in the world, welcoming all, especially those for whom a warm welcome was rarely extended. His world really was not unlike ours. Rome and Ephesus and Corinth, these were wild, fractured, crazy places, just like here today. And so we ask the same question: how can the community of faith, this community of faith, be an antidote to the loneliness, to the tribal nature of our culture and society? How can we be a true sanctuary, a place for connection and growth and service to others, especially those for whom a warm welcome is rarely extended? Since the first Jesus communities began to form, the invitation was this: come as you are and be transformed by the love of God made known in Christ. Be who you are, but even better, because you have been renewed in and through Christ. Their life and practice not only helped to cultivate a personal spiritual maturity, but it also served and it helped and guided and lifted those up, those who were far outside of the community. And this is still our hope and our prayer and our practice today, because we long for connections that support human flourishing, don't we? We want to flourish. We want those around us to flourish. And we know that together we can do that better than we could on our own. Together we can help to meet the longing and the ache in this world, but it takes more than just feeling love. We're invited to practice love, to develop a generosity of spirit, a willingness to serve even as we are served. And so this morning, let's just consider a few practices, a few ways that love is practiced as a community. practices that I believe form us into Christ likeness for the sake of the world. Forgive, listen, stay engaged. Now, Paul opens the section of the letter that we read this morning with the words, "Let love be genuine." And this literally means, let your love be unhypocritical. Your expression of love should have integrity. And immediately, I think we were like, uh-oh, that's going to pose a problem. Because what if I really don't like somebody? How can I love them? Doesn't that make my loving just kind of automatically hypocritical? Well, not if love is more about what you do than about how you feel. You see, for the church communities that Paul addressed, love was most often connected directly to helping people out of their need, usually a financial need. And the thing is, warm and fuzzy feelings weren't always attending those behaviors. It wasn't really even the point. And that leads to our first practice, forgive. More specifically, we are invited to forgive one another for not being God. Forgive one another for not being God. Catholic priest and Professor Henry Nouwen was well acquainted with the tough and tender nature of Christian communities. He knew what sustained them, and he knew what often caused them to crumble. And he writes, "Forgiveness means that I continually am willing to forgive the other person for not being God, for not fulfilling all of my needs. And I, too, must ask forgiveness for not being able to fulfill other people's needs." He continues, "The interesting thing is that when you can forgive people for not being God, you are just miraculously opened to celebrating that they, like you, reflect God." Maybe forgiving one another for not being God starts with forgiving ourselves the same, because we can be so hard on ourselves, can't we? And when we're hard on ourselves, we're just hard on the people around us and the world around us. When we're in fear and pain, feeling alone and reminded that we're not in control, it's easier to transmit that pain out to other people rather than be opened ourselves to be transformed, as Paul says, by the renewing of our minds, allowing the love of God in and through Christ to work its way in us, even when we're not feeling it. Dietrich Bonhoeffer famously said that strong faith communities are rooted in disillusionment. And what he meant was that in order to cultivate a community that truly becomes the gospel, we must strip ourselves of the illusion that genuine love is always lovely. Disillusioning ourselves of this belief allows us to actually open to the experience of love and community the way it really is. Messy and difficult, weepy and joyful, calm and fearful, suffering and celebratory, gruesome and filled with grace. Imperfect humans doing our best to open up and be channels of God's perfect love. And it has been my experience, long held, that when we are free to forgive one another for not being God, we are open. We just necessarily open to listen to one another with our whole hearts. And that's our second practice. Listen. Because our lives are bombarded by the voices of those people we barely know. And we work so hard to block out the noise that sometimes we fail to truly listen to the people that we really love and care about, the people that we really want to listen to. We're just either like half listening or waiting to offer our advice or our counsel or our correction, our opinion. And then if we don't agree with what we're hearing, okay, forget it. Listening usually becomes impossible. When do you find it difficult to truly listen to someone else? With whom and in what circumstances? Author Parker Palmer is so right when he says, "We are great at creating spaces that invite the intellect to show up, to argue its case and make its point, and we know how to create spaces that invite the emotions to show up, to express our anger or joy, and we certainly know how to create spaces that invite the will to show up, to consolidate effort and energy around a project and a common task. That's a good thing. We're good at that. And we surely know how to create space that invite the ego to show up, preening itself and claiming its turf, all in its place, I suppose, but we're not so great at creating spaces for listening to our true self and to the true self of the other. Do we make space to open to the person who we are when we're not retracting in fear or reacting in anger? Are we making space for that person? We have to consciously practice this way of listening. It just takes practice. And that's why Palmer conceived of these circle of trust touchstones. For many of you, this paper will be familiar. We use them all throughout Westside, in our small groups, in our studies, even in our session and business meetings. These are touchstones that remind us that people learn and grow best in hospitable spaces. Giving and receiving welcome within the group kind of sets the table for true listening without judgment. We're not there to attempt to fix or save or advise or correct each other. We are allowing for different opinions to be shared in a way that respects all of the other opinions in the room. And when judgment or defensiveness arise in you, which it will, you turn to wonder. I wonder what brought her to that opinion. And I actually kind of wonder why it's really getting me right now. I wonder. And instead of counseling or correcting, you respond with honest, open questions. Gee, Mark, I see it a really different way. So I'm wondering what brings you to that idea. Allowing curiosity and compassion to lead the way. True, deep listening is a powerful practice of love in community. And it's often said that when we are truly heard, we have the experience of being loved. They're so close that we rarely can tell the difference. An open ear is a clear sign of an open heart. Now, at this point, you might be wondering, is it really possible to love and care for somebody with whom you just really fundamentally disagree? Or what happens when, as it will and often does, the roof blows, or the louder voices in the culture, or maybe even in the room, grab you towards judgment, hate, dismissiveness, and fear? How do you keep your heart open then? Well, Paul's advice to the Roman church is this: be patient in affliction, persevere in prayer. In other words, stay engaged. And that's our third practice. Love is practiced when we stay engaged, when we remain emotionally connected with others, even when they don't agree, even when you're angry, even when you're hurt and feeling vulnerable. Connected without needing to change, convince, or fix. When I officiate weddings, which I love to do, I always remind the couple that the wedding process begins with what? Come on, guys. An engagement. I love that. The wedding begins with an engagement, and it's a reminder to the couple of what they will be called to do throughout their lives together. And it's a reminder for us too. Every time we turn toward one another instead of away from one another, every time we remain connected without disconnecting when it would be easier and it would feel quicker and safer, every time we're able to talk openly about the things that are important to us, take a clear position on where we stand on important issues, emotional issues, and calmly communicate our boundaries and tolerances. Every time we turn to prayer, to silence our fears and quiet our souls so that we can calmly be attuned to the next right thing. When we are able to stay engaged, we just naturally make space for conversation. And we make peace with not knowing yet. I read recently that intellectual flexibility and the capacity to consider multiple perspectives simultaneously is actually a sign of intelligence and cognitive maturity. I really love that. And even though I know it's difficult to hold competing ideas at the same time and not kind of choose one over the other, there is such power and beauty in holding space for paradox, in not knowing yet. That said, it's also true that staying engaged may at times involve leaving for a time, maybe to be safe. It may even mean leaving for good. But that's done in a conscious manner with love, capital L, love, as our guide. We practice staying engaged because continued growth can only take place within the assurance that we are allowing ourselves to be formed and transformed by the love of God who created us for just this. Forgiving one another for not being God, listening well, staying engaged. Friends, it won't always be comfortable, but I do believe it's what it looks like to love inclusively. To believe every human being is created in God's image. To love God and God's creations, ourselves, our neighbors, strangers, the marginalized, and our enemies. To value differences and honor diversity. To recognize unique perspectives, talents, and experiences, and learn from each other. To be a force in the world for what genuine, life-giving human community looks like. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, said the Lord, if you practice love for one another. Amen.